Hey guys, just wanted to give you the final installment on Tale of Two Cities. A lot of what happens in this section is going to help prepare you for the essays. You're going to be choices and you're going to get to see which ones you want to choose, but a lot of this is going to help with that. So here we go. In chapter 1, called In Secret, the traveler is Charles Darnay. You find that out in paragraph 2 or 3, but I just didn't want it to confuse anybody. The next thing is, so the motto of the French Revolution is liberty, equality, fraternity, or death. And that really is what they said. Now, eventually, the revolution went so far, they killed so many people that they dropped the or death. But part of it also comes from the famous American saying, give me liberty or give me death, that originated in the 1770s. So, 15, 20 years before the events of this chapter. So it's just interesting that that's historically accurate, even though they dropped the or death eventually. So the next thing is, Darnay is called an emigrant with an E. Just remember, an immigrant is someone who comes in with an I. An emigrant is someone who exits with an E, right? So what they're saying about Darnay is that he has left France, and therefore he must be one of the traitor aristocrats leaving France, trying to maintain their wealth after the revolution starts. Notice that Darnay isn't really threatened when he gets into France until he arrives at Beauvais. Bear in mind, that's where Alexander Manette is from. Remember, he's called the Doctor of Beauvais. And of course, that's important foreshadowing. So just remember that for later. When the guy in the prison writes in secret on Darnay's little paper, that means he's going into solitary confinement. So if you look at the top right corner, that's the picture of the prison where Darnay was held. Obviously, real prison, not a real guy, but La Force prison, and it means strength in French. So he was hidden, he was kept in solitary confinement in that building. And so bear in mind, A, that's the same as Alexander Manette, and B, we know, like, modern studies have demonstrated that solitary confinement can make people start to lose their minds. So this is actually a pretty big deal. Notice as Defarge is taking Darnay to his cell that they're having this big conversation, right? And Darnay says, how is this fair? I've never done this to anyone. How is this fair punishment for my happening to have been an aristocrat? I gave up the title. Well, what Defarge knows, so you notice that Defarge gives Darnay that dark look. Defarge knows that it was Darnay's family, his father and uncle, who sent Manette to prison. But Darnay doesn't know that. Manette protected him from that information. So that's why this seems fair to Defarge, but not to Darnay. In this chapter, when Dickens mentions the Great Massacre, he's talking about the September Massacre. It's important for a couple of reasons. One, the September Massacre, they killed hundreds and hundreds of people in a very, very short span of time, hundreds per day in some cases. The two groups being killed were prisoners. So what's interesting is the revolutionaries thought that the prisoners in La Force were going to band together to fight against the French Revolution. Well, this was the whole thing about the Bastille. Remember that the French Revolution started with the storming of the Bastille, and those were prisoners the aristocrats thought were going to band together to get rid of the aristocrats. And now the French Revolution is doing exactly the same kind of stuff that they fought against. Also, notice that hundreds of priests were killed in the September Massacre. So, because they refused to accept the new rules for the church that the French Revolution set out. Now, you don't get to kill priests because they don't do what you want, but remember from the last video that you had the three estates, remember, and the church was one of the top two estates. So the church had a lot of power and a lot of money while people were starving. So if you saw, priests dressed all in, golden robes with a ton of money and your kid was hungry, you'd be upset. The other thing to remember here is when the French Revolution was going on, a lot of other European countries were terrified. They thought, oh, revolution is also going to spread to us. So the aristocrats and the nobility in these other countries were scared, particularly in England. Well, the September Massacre went so far and killed so many people, that's when the French Revolution lost a lot of support. So, for example, a lot of the Romantic poets in England, like Wordsworth and those guys, supported the French Revolution until the September Massacre. And then they were like, whoa, y'all have gone too far, we're out, right? Next, so Darnay goes into jail. He's talking to an actual group of aristocrats who have been thrown in La Force, the prison, but he imagines them as ghosts. If that confused you, here's the deal. So Darnay is imagining that all of those real people he's talking to represent virtues and vices that are going to go away once the French Revolution kills all of those aristocrats. So he's saying, on the one hand, like, yes, we're getting rid of greed and tyranny and villainy and some bad stuff, but on the other hand, we're also getting rid of elegance, the love of beauty, these sort of luxury things that when you have money, you get to sit around and think about, literature and art and beauty and all that kind of stuff, right? So, Darnay is saying, there's good and bad happening here. There aren't any actual ghosts. He's just imagining that each of those people represents one of those virtues. Notice, okay, look, so Dickens tells us that it's 40 steps to Darnay's solitary cell. There's no reason for Dickens to tell us that unless it's significant. The two most significant numbers in the Bible, and then remember that Dickens is writing for a Christian audience, are 3 and 40. Okay, so in the Old Testament, you have the Noah flood story when the flood lasts for 40 days. And then Jesus in the New Testament is tempted in the desert for 40 days and 40 nights. So that's a just really significant number in terms of Christianity. So this is a test for Darnay, a test of his character. Okay. Next, you want to note that the prisoners had to buy their own food in La Force. Well, what's interesting is if you think back to book one, that was true in English prisons. It was true in the Bastille before the French Revolution. And so one of the reasons that the French Revolution happens is to get rid of corrupt practices like this. If you get thrown into prison because you can't pay your debt, and there was such a thing as debtor's prison back then, remember that Dickens' own family experienced that. If you're thrown into prison because you can't pay your debts, how do you buy your own food? This is insane, right? So people did starve to death in prison. The French Revolution's trying to get rid of that, but then they're doing it themselves. So Dickens is condemning them there. When Darnay starts rattling off the dimensions of his cell, so he's repeating numbers, right? And he's talking about making shoes. He's aligning himself with Manette. He and Manette are going through something very similar here. Chapter 2, the grindstone. First of all, notice Monseigneur, you remember him from before. He's the one who was like the worst of all the aristocrats, the most wealthy aristocrat. So he kind of represents the worst of the aristocracy. He had to sneak out of France in the uniform of his cook. I don't know if you noticed the word metempsychosis in that paragraph, but what Dickens is pointing out, metempsychosis means a supposed transmigration of a soul into a new body. And he's saying basically this: look, Monseigneur might have looked like a cook, he might have dressed like a cook, he might be poor now, but he is still the same person, he is still bad, he is still going to have to pay for his sins. Okay. The next thing, all right, so Tellson's bank sets up in Monseigneur's old mansion. And at one point, the clerk at the desk is kind of facing the statue of Cupid. Okay, so we think of Cupid, we think of Valentine's Day and love. Cupid also means something different in the society. So cupidity, and they would have all been familiar with this, just trust me, it sort of comes from the Latin Vulgate translation of the Bible, and you'll see it a lot in medieval literature, particularly Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer, and they would, Dickens' reading audience would have been familiar with this. So cupidity is greed or the love of money, and so radix malorum est cupiditas meant the love of money is the root of all evil. Okay, so when the banker is staring at the statue of Cupid, that's a whole meditation on greed and whatever. So there you go. Notice that Jarvis Lorry can see the big grindstone outside his window, and he's like, oh gosh, I'm so glad nobody I know is here. Charles Darnay is here, you just don't know it, y'all. The next thing I want you to notice is that Lucy Manette is really, well, she's Lucy Darnay now, whatever, is really being set up as the ideal woman in the society. And I want you to notice it's because she's pretty and she's blonde and she's sweet. She can make a home look beautiful. She's a good wife and mother. And she's always described as submissive. She submits to her father. She submits to Darnay. And here she says, oh, Mr. Lorry, I'll be submissive to you, and all this stuff. So this is the ideal woman in the society. And so I just want you to realize our society would probably read her as a weak, stupid character, but she's really being, praised a lot in this book. So what Jarvis Lorry can see out his window is people is the men sharpening this big blade on the grindstone. So you've probably figured out that that is the blade that goes in the guillotine. So they're actually sharpening the guillotine blade. You want to notice a couple of things. One, they're covered in blood and red wine, so they look scary and terrifying. B, they're disguised. They're wearing like fake eyebrows and fake mustaches and stuff, which probably seems weird, but Dickens' audience would have known executioners always wear a mask. They would wear a hood or whatever, so that it was impersonal. It was like you're getting justice, not, oh, I am killing this person, right? Now, later in this section of the book, this is going to come back. It's going to be important. The man who ran the primary guillotine in the French Revolution was actually famous. He's like a hero of the revolution. Everybody knew who he was. They recognized his face. They knew his name. And that was incredibly unusual. That just almost never happened. So that's why this is mentioned. And they're wearing trophies of those they've killed. If you notice, they're wearing ribbons and lace. That means that they have taken the ribbons and lace from the dresses of the aristocratic women they killed. So yikes. You also kind of want to remember watching them sharpen this blade is significant because in England, okay, so if someone were executed at the Tower of London, you had to bribe the executioner to sharpen the blade ahead of time so that it only took one stroke to kill you. In the same way that you had to pay for food when you were in prison. They do the same thing in the French Revolution. So again, Dickens' audience would have recognized that Dickens is criticizing the French Revolution for being every bit as barbaric as what came before it. All right. If you remember from the last video, that whole, Hegelian dialectic thing, you have one thing, then you have its opposite, right? Then hopefully you get the right answer. And so you see that the French Revolution really is just the opposite of what came before. Okay, again, our modern society is going to read the character of Lucy a little bit differently. So Charles Darnay gets in trouble. What does Lucy do? Packs up her father and her little daughter, who's, probably about kindergarten age here, and goes off to revolutionary Paris to try to save him. Okay. A modern mom would probably, send her father to rescue her husband, but would not put her child in that level of danger, okay? Bear in mind that our society sees motherhood a little bit differently. Back then, the infant mortality rate was very high. And a woman's first duty is to her father until she gets married. And then that first duty is to her husband. Okay, so now we think of the mom as being, her first duty is to her children. But back then, not all of the children survived. And also, the husband was the authority figure. According to Christian belief, he was in the same relationship to her as Christ is to the church. He's in charge of her. So Dickens' audience would have read this as great devotion in Lucy to her husband, which they would have praised. But to me, like, I'm horrified. I'm like, oh my gosh, like my son is about that same age and I would never take him to Paris during the French Revolution. It's crazy. So just sort of bear that in mind. So when Jarvis Lawrie is talking about the lesser grindstone, he's talking about the literal stone they're using to sharpen the guillotine blade. But when he says that the earth is the great grindstone, what he means is like everybody dies. Like the earth grinds everyone down to death eventually. So yay, thanks for that cheerful thought, Charles Dickens. Chapter 3, nice short one. First of all, notice Lucy clasps Defarge's hand in thanks. So it's ironic that she is bowing to the guy who used to be her father's servant, but also that he used that exact same hand to kill a lot of prisoners who are in Charles's exact same situation the night before in the September massacre. She also kisses Madame Defarge's hand, which is significant. We know that Madame Defarge is plotting against her, and here she is asking Madame Defarge to take pity on her as a fellow woman, which we know Madame Defarge is incapable of doing. And in fact, later in the book, Dickens clearly states that. Here's what's super interesting. Madame Defarge says to Lucy, your husband is not my business here. It is the daughter of your father who is my business here. So what Madame Defarge is saying is, look, I've got Charles Darnay. I'm not even worried about him. I'm after you now, which is terrifying. Okay. Remember that Madame Defarge gets really upset that Monsieur Defarge is still kind of subservient to this family. So she's taken it on herself. She's like, I'm going to get you because I know my husband won't, right? Bear in mind, okay, so Madame Defarge's shadow falls on Lucy and her daughter. This is the first time in the book that most people really realize that when Madame Defarge said she cursed the entire Evremond family, that includes Lucy and little Lucy. So this is the first hint we get that Madame Defarge really might be plotting to kill this kindergarten age little girl. Okay, so that's scary. Chapter 4, Calm and Storm. First of all, okay, so remember a couple of things. Alexander Manette, yeah, he knows that Charles Darnay's father and uncle are the ones who had him sent to prison. He knows it's Darnay's family that had him sent to prison. He also knows Darnay doesn't know this. He's protecting Darnay from that information. Second, he was in solitary confinement for, 20 years, right? Nevertheless, despite those two things, Manette asked to stay in prison with Charles Darnay to protect him. This is extremely cool. Like, Alexander Manette is an extremely cool human being. You would think, he would protect his daughter and granddaughter, but he knows, and you'll find out later in the book, Miss Pross and Jerry Cruncher, Jarvis Lorry, Sidney Carton, all of those people are going to show up in this part of the book. So Lucy and little Lucy are fairly well protected. It's Charles Darnay who's not. So this is really awesome. Alexander Manette's a super cool dude. Okay, so next thing, bear in mind, again, it's a Christian society. People were Catholic before, the French Revolution came. People, instead of wearing the Catholic cross, the crucifix, are now wearing little bitty guillotines. So like death has superseded religion here. Death is the new religion. So Dickens is really criticizing the French Revolution here. All right. This is the bit about the executioner. Okay, so when Dickens says the strong man of old scripture, he's actually talking about Samson. So you might not be familiar with the story, but in the Old Testament of the Bible, you had Samson and Delilah. And so Samson was a super strong dude. Nobody could defeat him. And so Delilah tricks him into revealing the source of his strength, which is that God has said he's never allowed to cut his hair. Seems weird, but okay. So she tricks him into getting that. She cuts his hair. He becomes weak. Now all of a sudden he can be defeated. So here, what you have to understand is that the guy who ran the primary guillotine in the French Revolution, his actual name was Samson. So remember I was telling you that the executioners always covered their faces except this guy? So Samson, the real Samson in revolutionary Paris, was a celebrity. And Dickens is sort of pointing out that he has this really interesting name because in the Old Testament, Samson was this incredibly strong guy. And then in revolutionary France, this guy was really named Samson, and he really killed thousands of people. Chapter 5, The Wood Sawyer. So at the beginning of this chapter, we find out Charles has been in prison a little over a year, like a year and 3 months. Just remember that his family is living not in one room. I actually should have gone back and changed that. The apartment was probably 4 or 5 rooms, which you find out later on in the book. But, his family is basically in prison as well. You'll find out later in the book that Lucy and little Lucy can't really leave the apartment. They have to send Miss Pross out to buy things for them because they don't want to draw attention to themselves. They know they could get in trouble at any time, and they know that Charles could be punished because they're there. So they basically are in prison with him. And again, Dickens society would have respected this sacrifice on their part. So it turns out that this woodcutter, Sawyer just means saw or cutter, yeah, is the same dude who was the mender of roads before, whom the Defarges turned into a revolutionary, okay? Also remember from book 1, the woodman is fate, okay? And the farmer represents death. That's actually going to come back around. So this guy, the wood sawyer, the woodman represents fate. And anyway, he's going to be really important. Pay attention to what he does. So next, you see that the people in this area, they're dancing the Carmagnole. That was a real dance at the time. If you click on the video link there, you can see what the dance looked like if you're interested in seeing it. Just bear in mind that what you're seeing is like a historical reenactment. What was happening in the novel is that these people were, they had revolutionary fever. They were on this weird sick high from killing all of these people, and so they would have done a really crazy, horrifying, grotesque version of this dance. The next link is a translation of the lyrics. There are a couple of kind of iffy words in that, so if you might be offended, please don't click on it. But it's historically accurate. It's a historical document, so I think it might be interesting to see. I still think it's worth putting in here. But basically, the lyrics that go to the Song of the Carmagnole, making fun of Marie Antoinette and being thrilled that she's dead. Just bear in mind what we learned in the first section, that Marie Antoinette actually did a lot for the poor. Now, to be fair, she was still incredibly wealthy while people in the country of which she was queen were starving to death. Okay, so she could have done a lot more than she did, but she wasn't nearly as bad as we think of her. At the end of the chapter, we find out Darnay's trial starts tomorrow. So here we go. Here is a painting of what somebody's interpretation of what the courtroom looked like. In the French Revolution, you'll see the French flag and the red cap up there. Think back to book one. So Charles Darnay's first case, right? When Sidney Carton, manages to win the case and set him free. The basic premise was, nobody gets out alive. If you're sentenced to trial in England, you're going to get killed. Like, don't even try, right? So the French Revolution is supposed to overturn those kind of corrupt justice systems, and it doesn't. The French Revolution does exactly the same thing. It's sort of assumed that Charles Darnay is going to be killed at the end of this trial, right? So again, Dickens is pointing out that the French Revolution is not helping anybody, really. You really, really need to remember that Madame Defarge and Ernest Defarge sit right next to Darnay the whole trial, but they don't look at him. This should be creepy, scary foreshadowing. All right, chapter 7, knock at the door. The footsteps Lucy hears recall the echoing footsteps from book 2. That's a theme all the way through. It's like, fate, danger, scariness, all that kind of thing. You can't control who comes up to your door. So it's supposed to be sort of a frightening symbol all the way through. So the Defarges first say that Darnay was denounced by Saint Antoine. If you look at this little map, the Rue Saint Antoine, it means Saint Antoine Street, right, runs right outside the Bastille. Now, I don't know exactly on this map where that neighborhood would have been, okay, but what the Defarges are saying is that, like, the whole neighborhood denounces him. And remember that neighborhood signifies poverty, hunger, despair, death. So what they're saying is that the despair of the people who lived on the land that the Evremonts controlled, all the people who've been oppressed by Charles's family, all of them are denouncing him. Now, legally, actual people have to denounce him. So number one, Madame Defarge. Number two, Ernest Defarge. Yeah. And then they're like, oh, who's the third one? And the Defarges are like, oh, Dr. Manette, don't you know? And he's like, no. Well, by the end of the chapter, the narrator says he's dumb. Now, remember, that means mute. He's not stupid. He's mute. He's unable to speak because he's figured it out. If you haven't figured it out, stick with me. Chapter 8, my favorite chapter in this whole book. Oh my gosh, it's so cool. Here we go. So Miss Pross finds Solomon Pross, her brother. So remember way back in the day, Solomon Pross was Miss Pross is like, oh, my brother Solomon, he was so awesome. He just made one mistake. Well, Jarvis Lorry knew the whole time that the whole reason Miss Pross has to be a servant to the Manette family is that Solomon Pross, her brother, took her money and ran off, and we haven't seen him again in the whole book, right? Or so we think. Anyway, so we know he's a worthless jerk. Anyway, Jerry Cruncher is amazed because he recognizes that Solomon Pross is actually John Barsad. Now, you remember John Barsad because he came in the Defarges' wine shop and he was spying against them. Now, you're going to find he's actually a mercenary. He is spying for both sides here. Sidney Carton has also shown up in Paris to help Jarvis Lorry. He reveals Solomon Pross / John Barsad as a spy. And then Carton is bullying John Barsad here. And he's like, look, I've got all these cards against you. And of course, the whole thing is a metaphor. He's just sort of pretending that they're playing a card game. Now, one of the things that Carton knows is that Barsad conspired to have Darnay arrested when Alexander Manette was out of the apartment. Because so Alexander Manette's this big hero of the revolution. Nobody's going to arrest Darnay if Manette is there to protect him. So Barsad is the one who sent the signal to the revolutionaries. So see, now he's spying on the other side. Hey, y'all, Manette's gone. He's tending to prisoners. You can go arrest Darnay. So John Barsad / Solomon Pross looks at Sidney Carton and he goes, dude, you wouldn't denounce me. Like, you're kind of friends with my sister and that would like crush my sister. You'd never do it. And Sidney Carton goes, I could not better testify my respect for your sister than by finally relieving her of her brother. So Carton is like, dude, I would be thrilled to have you dead because that would help your sister. The only person who doesn't recognize that Solomon Pross / Barsad is a total jerk is Miss Pross. God bless her. All right. So Carton also reveals that Roger Cly is working with Solomon Pross/John Barsad. Now, you remember Roger Clive from the very beginning of the book. I told you he was going to come back around. He was Charles Darnay's old servant who spied on him and denounced Charles Darnay and sent him to prison for the first time. Okay. Barsad is like, no way, that dude is dead. And Jerry Cruncher's shadow moves against a wall here. That's because Jerry Cruncher knows that Roger Clive's coffin was empty. So remember, Jerry Cruncher is a gravedigger. He digs up bodies, he sells them to the medical researchers, whatever. And so Roger Clive's coffin was the one that he dug up. There were only rocks and paving stones in it. And he goes home and beats his wife because he thinks his wife has prayed against his grave robbing because she thinks it's evil and unnatural. Notice, okay, at the end, Carton pours himself a glass of brandy and then he pours it out. This is extremely symbolic. Remember, Sidney Carton is like, oh, he's a drunk, he's an idiot, whatever, and nobody realizes he's really the brains behind the whole operation. So now he's not drinking. You'll never see him drink again in the book. He's going to order wine one time, but he's not going to drink it. And so what's fascinating here is that not drinking signifies that Carton is redeemed, okay? Chapter 9, the game made. This means Carton wins, okay? Laurie guesses how Jerry knew that Clive's coffin was empty. I mean, how would you know the guy's coffin was empty if you weren't the one who dug it up? And Jerry's like, oh no, I did work of an agricultural character. I mean, he's a digger, I guess. Anyway. So look, this whole part is really interesting to me because Jarvis Lorry says, hey, I'm not going to keep working with you. I'm going to have you fired because you're a grave digger and that's bad and wrong. And Jerry says, wait a second. One, you, through Tellson's Bank, deal with the medical researchers who buy these bodies. You don't get to punish me because I'm poor, but still deal with them because they're wealthy. That's not fair. And of course, remember that Charles Dickens grew up poor. This is important social commentary. And the second thing is, Jerry points out, look, this stuff saves lives. You weren't allowed to operate on dead bodies at the time. You weren't allowed to cut up dead bodies at the time. You couldn't donate your body to science. So how did people learn how to be surgeons? People who couldn't pay were experimented on. Okay, so again, Dickens grew up poor. Dickens is really concerned with the plight of the poor. So, and they don't have good anesthetic at the time. This saves lives. Like, I don't know if you can tell I'm talking a little funny right now because I am currently recuperating from jaw surgery. I have directly benefited from people like Jerry Cruncher who dug up these bodies and gave them to medical researchers so that they could learn how the human body works and how to perform surgery. So we owe a great debt to these people. And Jerry makes a great point. So there. So Carton wins the game against Barsad, right? And remember, it's not a literal card game. It's blackmail. All right. So because Carton knows that he could denounce Barsad, and if he does, the Defarges will have Barsad killed. All Carton manages to get is access to Charles Darnay one time if the trial goes against him. So notice that. Notice Carton tells Jarvis Lorry that his life is worthless without relationships, and notice that Carton buys something dangerous at the chemist shop. So you've got those 3 clues right there, and that should help you start figuring out what Sidney Carton's plan is to save Charles Darnay. Last thing before we flip to the next screen, Carton is dressed all in white. Now look, is that remotely logical? He's gone into revolutionary Paris. It's a city. It's dirty. It's nasty. It's dangerous. Nobody would wear all white, stupid. So it has to mean something. And he uses his foot to kick a log back into the fire, and then he forgets and leaves his foot there, but he doesn't get burned. Both of those things are setting you up to realize that Sidney Carton is a martyr. He's going to give his life, okay, to save Charles Darnay. Remember, what's Sidney Carton's first name? Sidney. Where does that come from? Saint-Denis. He was a martyr. Okay. So all of this is really symbolic. Thank you, Charles Dickens. All right. When Carton carries this little girl across the road and asks for a kiss, it seems super weird. But let me tell you. So first of all, the roads in these cities, they don't have the kind of, technology, sanitation, and sewage that we have. So the roads are full of filth of all kinds. So like right now, if some strange guy picked up my kid, I would call 911 and I would, scream and yell and all this kind of stuff. But at the time, this is actually kind of a cool thing. He's carrying her across so she doesn't have to walk through this nasty filth. And the kiss, Monks actually use it. Christian monks actually used to greet each other this way. There's a Bible verse about it, greet the brethren with a holy kiss. And it was actually a Christian blessing. So it would have been like on the cheek or the forehead. It's not weird at all. It would have been totally normal in a Christian society. Okay, so don't worry about that. Notice that the three Jacques from book one are at the trial. Remember, Jacques was the sort of basic name for any of the revolutionaries. The third accuser is Manette. Now, would Alexander Manette actually denounce Charles Darnay? No, look at all he's given up for Darnay. But here we go. Notice the tribunal no longer treats Manette deferentially. Manette has used up all of his power, all of his influence as the hero of the revolution to save Charles Darnay up to this point. There's nothing else. He doesn't have anything else left. Now, think back. Okay, I think it was in book two. Remember that Charles Darnay comes home and he's like, hey, Dr. Manette, did you read this whole thing in the paper about how they found this document hidden in the Tower of London, written by one of the prisoners there? And Dr. Manette freaks out. And remember, I said in that video, it has to be significant. We know that Alexander Manette was never in the Tower of London. So where does this come from? I don't know. Now we know. So at the time, Alexander Manette wrote out the whole reason that he was put in prison and hid it behind a loose brick in his cell, hoping that someone would eventually find it and, hear the true story. Now he has been hoping that nobody would find it because he wants to protect his son-in-law. And Fooey, Defarge found it. So now he figures it out. At that last paragraph in there, just notice where everybody's looking. Don't memorize it or anything, but it's really interesting that it's all of the way the power is connected. So-and-so is looking at so-and-so and all of these sort of predatory looks. It's really interesting. All right, chapter 10, the substance of the shadow. Here's what that means. Think about, well, where does your shadow come from? Like, where's the substance of your shadow? It's the origin of the shadow. It's your physical body, right? So when Madame Defarge's shadow falls on Lucy and little Lucy, the origin is her. She herself is the origin of that shadow. Well, here's the substance of it. Here's why she wants to kill even little Lucy, this little kindergarten aged beautiful little girl. This is insane. Okay, now we know. So here's Manette's letter, and he tells us the whole story. Remember that Dickens has all these pairs all the way through the book. So notice when stuff comes back around. So for example, the carriage, the Evremond carriage, almost runs Manette down, just like the Evremond carriage ran down Gaspard's son earlier in the book. Okay. Notice the carriage is driven by twins and that the woman is tied down with a scarf embroidered with the E for Evremond. That's how you find out that it's Charles's father and uncle who are doing this. Okay. So Monsieur the Marquis, and that's Charles's uncle. So remember that, one of them is actually the elder, even though they're twins. One of them was born before the other one, I don't know, 5 minutes or 10 minutes or something before the other one, but he's technically the first one. And that's important because that's who gets the title. Charles's dad was the oldest one, and then Charles's uncle was, the younger one. Even if it was 5 minutes younger, he doesn't get the title. Yeah. So it was Charles's uncle, the guy who ends up being the Marquis when we're reading about it in book 2, who saw this beautiful peasant woman, wanted her, worked her husband to death, and then took her. Okay. So that was Charles's uncle, not Charles's father. Now, Charles's father helped cover it up. Charles's father is the one who tosses money to that woman's brother, just like Charles's uncle, 25 years later, tosses money to Gaspard when he kills Gaspard's son. Okay, so all this kind of stuff it mirrors. Just bear in mind, it's Charles's uncle who kills this woman's husband and does terrible things to this woman. And then the brother is killed in the sword fight, avenging his sister's honor. But he also says, hey, I have this younger sister. I'm going to send her off somewhere else to live so that she's safe, protected from the Evremond family. Okay. So that's going to be really important later. The woman sitting downstairs who couldn't do anything was Charles's mother, married to Charles's dad, obviously. And she's not married to the guy who, killed this guy and stole his wife, but she is married to the man who helped his brother cover up what he'd done. All right. Notice that, okay, so the brother is lying on the ground, dying, the woman's brother, and he dips his fingers in his own blood the wound and curses the whole Evrémonde family. That's why Madame Defarge curses the whole Evrémonde family. That's where it starts. Notice that the woman is pregnant. Okay, so Dickens has given us a couple of clues. Her husband was very sick. Her dad was like, don't bring any kids into the world. She only marries her husband to help take care of it. She loves him, but she only marries him to help take care of him so she can, live with him. Remember, this is a conservative Christian society. So she can live with him and help take care of him until he dies. So the baby is probably not her husband's baby. It is probably the child of Charles's uncle. Does that make sense? Okay. The brothers, the Evrémonde brothers, think that they can just give Manette some money and then he'll keep their secret because he's on the rise. They think everybody is like them. They think that Manette is just like them and he will seize this opportunity for power. But what they don't know is that he's a good man. Every time somebody in this book refuses or returns money, it means he's a good man. So Charles doesn't take his inheritance. Gaspard tosses back the coin. He won't accept the coin for the death of his son. The woman's brother doesn't accept the coins that Charles's father throws to him. And Manette doesn't accept the gold coins that the brothers try to give him. Okay, so this demonstrates he's a good person. It's when Manette actually writes to the minister to tell the truth that he seals his fate. Obviously, the minister is in league with, the Evrémondes. That, all the aristocrats kind of knew each other. So, okay. So this next bit is actually pretty important and I think pretty interesting. So Charles's mother later on goes to visit Alexander Manette and she's like, hey, I know that this woman, my brother-in-law killed and my husband, helped cover the whole thing up. I know this woman had a younger sister who was sent away. Is there any way we can do anything for her? I'd like to give her some money or something. So first of all, this is cool. Charles's mom is a good woman. This is why Charles turns out to be a good man. 2, Charles was only 2 or 3 at the time, but this is the first time he meets Alexander Manette, right? So 3, remember it was the first or second video, I can't remember. Charles Darnay takes his mother's last name because he doesn't want to be associated with his father or his uncle. He wants to, live on his own terms. So he chooses the woman's last name, but he still can't escape this sort of patriarchal society that he lives in. He refuses the birthright, right? So the inheritance and the title pass from father to brother to son, okay? And remember that the Defarges still insist on calling him an Evrémonde. They won't let him take his mother's identity. They won't let him divorce himself from that family. So I just think it's really interesting that a male writer like Charles Dickens is asking these questions about the patriarchal society he lives in. I think it's really interesting. At the end of Manette's letter, when he tells the whole story of how he gets in prison, he does denounce the Evrémondes. He's like, I denounce this whole family, just like the Defarges said. Now, obviously, Manette had no idea that his daughter was going to marry this, little 2 or 3-year-old he met. So gosh, super sad. Notice the Defarges waited until Manette's power had been used up to protect Charles. That's why they were sitting in the courtroom, right? Staring at Charles Darnay, but not saying anything. So they let Alexander Manette use up all of his influence to save Charles Darnay, and then they pounce when there's nothing else that Manette can do. Chapter 11, Dusk. In the courtroom, Darnay all of a sudden realizes what Manette has gone through to accept him. Like, Darnay has no idea. He doesn't know that it was his own father and his own uncle who sent Manette to prison. He has no idea. Remember, Darnay told Manette his real last name before the morning of the wedding, before Charles marries Lucy, and Manette doesn't say anything. And remember, he goes crazy for 9 days again. So all of a sudden, Darnay is just so moved because he realizes everything Manette has given up and put up with to support him and to protect him and to allow him to marry his daughter. This is really incredible. Notice that little Lucy says, oh, Sidney Carton, can you save my dad? When he whispers a life you love, that's supposed to remind you of the promise that Carton made to Lucy, little Lucy's mom, that, if he could ever give his life to keep a life she loves beside her, that he would. And we know that he's plotting to give his life to save Charles Darnay. Therefore, when Carton says, all right, listen, Manette, really, please do everything you can to save Charles Darnay, we know he's actually begging for his own life, which is pretty cool. And of course, Carton is still not drinking. That shows he's reformed and he's awesome. All right, chapter 12. So some interesting, cool stuff happens here. Notice that Defarge really tries to convince his wife to spare Darnay, but she's not even considering Darnay. She's on to Lucy and little Lucy. Um, so like Ernest Defarge can't even conceive of the revenge his wife has planned. The vengeance, remember, she's Madame Defarge's best friend. She calls Madame Defarge an angel, but realize like we think of an angel in a positive way, but there it could also be the angel of death. So realize she means something different there. So when Ernest Defarge is like, oh, hey, honey, please, let's just like rein in the revenge a little bit. She says, tell the wind and fire where to stop, but not me. Remember the great grindstone is the earth and the lesser grindstone is the guillotine or the thing that sharpens the guillotine blade. She is like playing God here. Madame Defarge is being the great grindstone. She's being a force that's much bigger than any one person ought to be. So this is letting you know she's overstepping her bounds. By this point, Dickens goes ahead and spells out to you that Madame Defarge was that younger sister who was sent away, whom Charles's mom tried to do something for but wasn't able to. And then Carton, this is kind of a stupid part of the book. Carton goes into the Defarge's wine shop because he recognizes that they need to be able to recognize him. He wants to make sure that they see him. You'll find out why in a couple more chapters. But he's like, oh, I am English. I don't speak any French. And they're like, oh, okay, we believe you. And then they spill their whole plan right in front of him. What are the odds, y'all? Slim. That's what. When Manette realizes that he can't save Darnay, that's when he goes back to, making shoes again. So you can tell that's really sad. All right. So remember earlier we were talking about I was talking about how Ernest Defarge is really morally compromised. I mean, is he keeping Manette kind of in a prison and letting people come in, to pay and see Manette? Is he kind of still keeping him in prison, or is he helping the revolution along? And Laurie calls Manette the figure Defarge had in keeping, and had in keeping means to keep in prison. So this really puts the blame on Defarge, not only for not saving Manette or Darnay, really, but also not being strong enough to stop his wife. Bear in mind, okay, the society that Dickens is writing for, women have no rights. They can't vote. They can't own their own property. They pass on the control of their fathers to their husbands when they get married. They can't control their own money. They don't control their own children. Now in a divorce, the wife usually, the woman usually gets custody of the children, at least primary custody, and that wasn't remotely true back then. So in this society, everyone expected that Ernest Defarge should be able to control his wife, and he can't. So that's the point we're making here. Notice that Sidney Carton has obviously had this plan in place for a long time. He magically has these papers allowing the Darnays and Manette to leave France unharmed, but they could be recalled anytime. Remember, recalled to life in book 1, kept showing up all the time. So that's why this whole thing is significant. It turns out that the wood sawyer, the mender of roads, remember he represented fate, he's Defarge's spy. He's going to denounce little Lucy, and Alexander Manette because they were waiting outside the prison window in the hopes that Charles Darnay would see them. So that's why he represents fate, because he certainly could be their fate at this point in the book. And the chapter ends with Carton staring up at Lucy's window again, the way he used to do, earlier in the book. So I gave you a little more Edward Cullen there because I just don't think it's hilarious. All right, chapter 13, 52. So 52 people were supposed to be killed by the guillotine that day. Notice that as Darnay makes his final arrangements and he's writing the letters to Alexander Manette and to his wife, he never thought of Carton. Sidney Carton has done nothing but think of Charles Darnay for a very long time. And of course, we know that Carton is doing this because he's in love with Lucy Darnay. But still, it's kind of sad, right? Notice Carton has to bully Darnay and Barsad to make his plan work. Like, Carton has been drunk and stupid this whole time, or at least acting stupid this whole time. Now, all of a sudden, he quits drinking. He's forceful. He's powerful. He's getting stuff done. So this is actually pretty important. Huge change in Sidney Carton. As the carriage leaves France with, the family in it, we now get why Carton made sure to be seen at the Defarge's wine shop. Darnay has been in prison for almost a year and a half. Nobody really recognizes Darnay. So Carton wants to make sure that they've seen him so that there's no suspicion about who this is, that it's obviously Sidney Carton, that Englishman we saw in the wine shop before, right? Notice that the narration shifts to free and direct discourse again. If it confused you, It's just because all of a sudden, with no apparent warning, the narration is what's going on inside Jarvis Lorry's head as they're escaping. Okay, he's like, "Oh my gosh, are we gonna make it?" And he's all scared. When Darnay starts to wake up, the last thing he remembers is talking to Sydney Carton. So finally, somebody's thinking of Sydney Carton, right? And that's why that comes full circle. Chapter 14, the knitting done. Of course, remember that Madame Defarge's knitting is when she's writing down people's names who are going to be denounced in the revolution. And so now the knitting is over. I just kind of noticed Dickens is setting you up to see Madame Defarge is totally unnatural here. Women are supposed to be submissive. They're supposed to be sweet and pretty. They're supposed to be like Lucy. But Madame Defarge, remember, she wields a knife like a man. She goes behind her husband's back because he isn't going to support her in denouncing Lucy and little Lucy. It's unnatural in that time period. It's considered unnatural for a woman not to have a child, not to care about children. Even in our modern society, we assume that women are more concerned with children and, oh, we love kids and whatever, more than men do. People still kind of hold to that stereotype. So that's why Madame Defarge is considered so unnatural and evil in this book, right? So Jerry swears two things if they all survive. One, no more grave digging, and two, no more interfering with his wife's prayers. And he says, in fact, I hope she's praying right now. Well, what's interesting is, he sees the purpose in grave digging. He sees how it's helpful, but he's still going to turn against it because he kind of finds religion in the middle of this crisis, right? This is also the first time Madame Defarge has switched from calling Lucy the daughter of Manette to the wife of Evremond. And bear in mind, that means that Lucy is no longer protected by being her daughter's father. By being her father's daughter. She is now going to share the punishment of her husband. So she's no longer under her father's protection. When Miss Pross and Madame Defarge have their little meeting, in the apartment, notice they're like the exact opposites. Okay, the family's devoted friend versus the malevolent enemy, right? And what's funny is it's supposed to be comic relief is that Pross is shouting at Madame Defarge in English and Madame Defarge doesn't understand a word, and the reverse is true. Madame Defarge is just yelling at Miss Pross in French and she doesn't understand a word. So it's supposed to be kind of funny. And then when the gun goes off, it is an accident. They're struggling for control of it. Miss Pross doesn't do it on purpose. Chapter 15, the footsteps die out forever. So remember, the footsteps are menacing. So this is pretty important. Paragraph 1 points out that what happens in the revolution is just human nature, and it happens cyclically. So like during the school year, Mr. McAuliffe is going to say, oh, you have to learn history or, we're doomed to repeat it. And you've heard that before. And the thing is, we think, oh, this happened hundreds of years ago. We would never let that happen again. But Dickens points out, this kind of thing keeps happening. It's happened all the way through history. And every time period thinks, oh no, we're different, right? It's that Hegelian thing all over again. This just keeps happening as a cycle. The reason Sidney Carton shakes his hair over his face is to maintain his disguise. Remember that the people he's with now have seen Darnay. They've been in the prison. They have seen Charles Darnay. They were at the trial, so he's more likely to be recognized here. Bear in mind, Sidney Carton is like, oh no, I hope John Barsad / Solomon Pross keeps his mouth shut. But Barsad / Pross is definitely going to keep his mouth shut. He wants Carton dead. Carton has 3 or 4 ways to denounce John Barsad to the revolution and get him killed. So he's not going to say anything. This part is super interesting to me. So the Vengeance finally calls Madame Defarge by her first name, which is Thérèse. It's the French version of Teresa, right? Well, 2 really interesting things here. We know that names and naming are really important. They're significant all the way through this book. The name Teresa means harvester or reaper. Okay, like Grim Reaper, right? Like you're harvesting. So remember that the woodcutter symbolized fate and the farmer symbolized death. So Madame Defarge is death, right? Her name means harvester, like a farmer. So she represents death. So when she dies, death kind of dies, right? The French Revolution starts sort of calming down. Death is no longer a threat, right? The little girl Carton helps across the street and little Lucy, the kind of kisses he exchanges with those little girls are those Christian blessings like we were talking about before. And that's the same kind of kiss he exchanges with the seamstress, Okay, it's a Christian blessing. It's not weird. Don't worry. Carton imagines that the Darneys are going to name this child after him, and the kid is going to grow up to be awesome and come back and appreciate what Sidney Carton gave up so that he could live. And that's the balance of the present Carton. Remember that the Hegelian synthesis is you have one extreme, then the other, and then you find the right way, right? So we have had these two extremes of Sidney Carton, doing sort of a terrible job. He's sort of balanced out with Charles Darnay. And now you get this Hegelian synthesis that this kid is gonna gonna live and make the world a better place. So yay. Dickens makes the point that the evils of the aristocratic rule of France are balanced out by the evils of revolutionary rule, but now they've canceled each other out, the next age can be good. Okay, so again, Sidney Carton is terrible, and then he's perfect, right? This gives rise to this imaginary Sidney Darnay, who may or may not, ever exist. In the same way, you have the aristocratic rule. Well, they're terrible. French Revolution, oh gosh, they're terrible, just in the opposite way. And then theoretically, modern France stands a chance of being this great place, is sort of what Dickens is saying. I hope that makes sense. In terms of the essay, that's one of the choices. And then also another choice is, notice all these balanced pairs. You have Carton and this imaginary future Sidney Darnay, Pross and Barsad, Pross and Madame Defarge, Carton and Darnay, the Evremond twins, Charles's father and uncle, both of the evil regimes in France, the Defarge, all of these kind of balances, and I'm sure there are a bunch more that I haven't listed here. So think about the fact that Dickens does this all the way through. Try to think of another book in which there are this many. Like it's pretty obvious that it's on purpose. Just two more slides here. So stick with me for a second, y'all. The last sentence is very famous. The first sentence of this book we talked about it's very famous. The last sentence is famous too. It's a far, far better thing I do than I've ever done. Sidney Carton says this because he's saying that this is the best thing he's ever done in his life. That giving up his life is the best thing he could possibly do with his life. He's kind of wasted his life. So giving it up for someone else is the best thing he could possibly do. Remember I said he was a martyr? Then he says, it's a far, far better rest I go to than I've ever known. So rest, like sleep, right? But what he really means is he believes he's going to heaven. Here's the deal. Sidney Carton thinks that by giving up his life, he's become good, he's reformed himself, and he gives up that life for Charles Darnay. He thinks that's the only way he's going to get into heaven. And so he actually thinks this is the best possible thing that he can do. Because now, he was not headed to heaven in his previous life, and now he is. Okay, so he's actually thinking of this as like an awesome moment, right? Anyway, I just kind of want to make the point that when he imagines this kid praising him, this future, imaginary Sidney Darnay praising him, and Charles and Lucy Darnay saying, oh my gosh, Sidney's so awesome. He's not thinking of that in a self-aggrandizing way. He's like, this is the only way my life is worth anything, is if I give it up for these people. Last slide here, y'all. Remember I was telling you, okay, the book is called Tale of Two Cities. And that's Dover and Calais, the two cities on either side of the English Channel. And then it's also London and Paris, the seats of government and power for both of those countries. Well, it also reflects a philosophy that everyone in Dickens' time period would have been 100% familiar with, okay? St. Augustine proposed this idea of the two cities. I mean, that's what it's called, the two cities. So there's no way that's not what Dickens meant, okay? The city of God and the city of man. So St. Augustine says we're living in the city of man, which is an imperfect world. People in Augustine's time period believed that if you were rich and powerful, it's because you were good and God had blessed you and that you deserved that wealth and power. But we know that some wealthy, powerful people are bad people. Like it is what it is. So St. Augustine said, y'all can't keep believing this. We don't live in a true meritocracy, but in the city of God, in this city, we should try to make happen in God's ideal world, it would be a true meritocracy. The good people would be rewarded and the bad people would always be punished, whereas we know that that's not true. So think about what the narrator says at the end of the book about revolutionary Paris. And he's saying, look, now we're living in the city of man, but if we learn a lesson from this, we could be living in the city of God. And of course, Sidney Carton is living in the city of man, but he believes he's going to live in the city of God after he gives his life for Charles Darnay. So obviously, this philosophy, called The Two Cities, I mean, has a lot to do with this book. So that's another one of the essay choices. I hope this was helpful, and you are obviously welcome to ask me any questions when school starts. Okay, bye.